Hello, everyone. Welcome to INACOL's September Leadership Webinar. My clock here says 2 p.m. Eastern, so we're going to go ahead and get started as folks continue to trickle in. Thank you very much for attending today's wonderful webinar on key takeaways and lessons learned from next generation learning models. We have a wonderful lineup of panelists today to present, so I promise not to take up too much of your time, but before we get started, just a few administrative items. In the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a chat box. Please introduce yourself. Let us know who you are, where you're from, what you do, any questions that you have for us today, and we'll be sure to get those answered during Q&A. If you are a member of the Twitterverse, we also plan to extend the conversation there as well using hashtag NextGenLearning, and you can always tag INACOL's Twitter handle as well. So we'll put that in the chat box. Oh, there it is for you right there if you want to share what you're learning with your peers and colleagues on Twitter today. And throughout the webinar, please ask questions in the chat box too. We're going to pause after each presenter goes through their slides today for a little bit of Q&A. So be sure to ask those questions as they pop up for you. Lastly, today's webinar will be recorded and archived on the inacol.org website. So you'll be able to access this full presentation as well as download the PowerPoint slides. So we'll send you a follow-up email with links to those resources, but just know that it will be recorded today. Now, to turn it over to our wonderful panel today, Stephanie is going to kick us off from Next Generation Learning Challenges on a broad global picture of next generation learning. And then Tim from Leap Innovations is going to take a deeper dive and discuss more team-level activities. And then Larry is going to discuss finance. How do you pay for all of this? So with that, I'm grateful to turn it over to Stephanie today. So Stephanie, if you want to toggle on that talk button, it's all you.
Thank you so much, and I'm so excited to be here today to share key takeaways and lessons learned from NGLC schools. So I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about who NGLC is and what we do. So NGLC was founded in 2010 on two core principles. The first being that the student experience in school needs to be more about learning and less about teaching. And the second principle is that while we all have a role to play, it's the educators who should lead the work because they're closest to students and the learning. And so we see NGLC's role in all of this as to enable those educators. And we do that by focusing our efforts in the 4 areas shown in the image here, by imagining it, creating it, living it, and growing it and supporting all those activities that you see listed there. So how will this transformation happen? We think that transformation will happen over time, and you see that here in this arc, as educators build on and leverage the practice level work, so the early evidence, the strategies and tools of the pioneer innovators that slice over there on the left, and that's where the NGLC grantees come in. So who are our grantees? Well, to date, NGLC and our funding partners have directly invested and catalyzed funding to national grantees and our regional funds partners, and that total investment has resulted in the launch of approximately 130 breakthrough school models organized around next-gen learning, and you see them plotted there along the map. So the principles of next-gen learning as NGLC defines them are personalized, student-centered, competency-based, tech-enabled, and offering what we call experiential learning toward richer, deeper definitions of student success. And collectively, the work of these 130 schools represents what we consider the nation's largest and most visible set of reimagined, redesigned schools reflecting those dimensions of next-gen learning that I just mentioned. And so the lessons I have to share with you today are really key takeaways from NGLC schools. And you'll notice that these lessons apply rather universally. And we think that these create a solid foundation upon which to build. This is especially true now with ESSA. Through ESSA, as you all know, The feds are enabling states and districts to opt into transformation towards personalized learning, and we think it makes a whole lot of sense to share what's been developed, tested, and refined, and we think that there's a lot to learn from the work and experience of our NGLC schools. So the first 4 lessons I'll share with you are gathered from our grantees during their work of envisioning and launching new models. So the first lesson you see here, be as ready as possible and then plan and iterate. This is an often heard lesson from our grantees, and it's really a version of expect your model to change once you get to know the students that you'll be serving. That's only something that you can partially predict, and it will almost always surprise you. Our grantees have shared over and over again the importance of leading with a growth mindset, persistence, urgency, and patience. And I'll share with you some stories as we go throughout this deck. The first story is from Building 21. It's a non-selective district school in Philadelphia. And so a really important feature of Building 21 is their competency-based approach. They believe that students need to demonstrate proficiency or growth multiple times in multiple contexts. And in their competency-based system, they started by establishing evidence requirements that would communicate to students how many times the students needed to demonstrate evidence, say on writing-based, evidence-based arguments, just evidence in general. And what they did was a bunch of research looking at workloads of college freshmen, and then they made some educated guesses about how to scaffold those requirements over 4 years. And it turns out their guesses were wrong. They had way too many evidence requirements, and to make matters worse, their online system was not yet nimble enough to make those changes. And so in a conversation with leaders at Building 21, they shared that they were thinking about literally dropping their competency-based model. They were so fearful and reacting to that fear and anxiety. They were as ready as possible. They had a great plan on paper, and then reality set in, and they began to revisit their evidence and their competency-based plan, and they really had to use persistence and patience to find their way to a better solution, one that would better match where their students were coming in at. So they were doing this all while being guided by a growth mindset and evidence of student learning and feedback. So the next lesson is to build a clear and compelling narrative. Everyone on this call, everyone has experienced school, and changes to school and schooling are viewed through that lens, the lens with which we hold. NGLC grantees share over and over again the importance of focusing on student learning and hinging your model narrative on your key components. They underline the importance of explaining why a new or different approach to learning is better for students. One of our grantees, Montessori for All in Austin, Texas, took the time to build a really clear, concise, and compelling narrative. They had to do so as part of their requirements for applying for NGLC funding, and they did it in only 10 slides. And Sarah Kottner from Montessori for All shared that that was really an exercise that forced them to get very clear really fast about what they were trying to do. They were trying to blend best practices from high-performing charters with the principles of authentic Montessori in order to close the achievement gap and cultivate leaders of tomorrow. And Sarah had recently shared with me that the process of capturing that work in such a condensed fashion required them to really be articulate about their model and do so very precisely. And she says that those 10 slides serve as a foundation for them, that they go back to them frequently when they're trying to communicate the story about what they're trying to do with families, when they're applying for additional funding, or when they're trying to onboard new board members, and even when they're hiring new teachers. Everything stems for them from that vision that they had, and then the story that they were able to tell in a clear, concise, and compelling way. The next lesson is really to engage early and often, and I know Tim's going to get really deep into the specifics on how to engage teams, so I won't spend a lot of time there. But NGLC grantees continuously point to the importance of building a strong foundation of support, and that comes from engaging thoughtfully all stakeholders. And I have several links at the end of my presentation that you can access that would support your work there. But what we've learned from our grantees is that the work of engagement continues well beyond the initial design and launch. Summit CEO and co-founder Diane Taverner shared a story with us at a NGLC convening where she said really that after several years of implementation at Summit, they realized they needed to do a better job of communicating and engaging parents. And I'll give you some of the tips that she shared with us. She really is a champion of increasing contact with parents. She says you should think about what you're currently doing and then double or triple your efforts, even if it feels like overkill. So for example, if you do back to school night and an orientation at the beginning of the year, then double or triple the number of events that you hold and spread them out over time. She's a champion of bringing parents into the school, and she thinks that engaging parents in that way helps them to develop an understanding of what learning looks like. And what they do at Summit is they have weekly teaching and learning tours for parents, and they hold celebrations of learning every 6 weeks that are led by students. The last piece of continuing and deepening engagement that Diane shared with us was to develop a really comprehensive communication strategy. And so that can look at email, newsletters, text messages, pushing information out on social media, and really thinking carefully and clearly about using multimedia such as video clips and interactive PDFs. So at Summit, what they do is that every day for the first month of school, parents will receive an email with video clips and a tip of the day, and then that moves later in the year to becoming a weekly communication. So the next lesson that I'll share with you from our grantees is to foster and sustain a strong culture. We've heard from our grantees over and over a version of culture eats strategy for lunch, and it usually goes something like this. We got so busy with the details of opening school and attending to the first days and weeks that we let our intentional culture building slip. And our grantees would tell you, don't do it. And their advice would really be to think about and co-shape your norms, your beliefs, your behaviors, your values, establish traditions, and then use them. They should permeate all of your decisions and all of your actions, and staff should be in total alignment. And when things go wrong, because they will, it's a perfect time to intentionally use your culture and your norms to guide you back in very transparent and explicit ways. So our grantees will tell you that the lessons never stop coming and that there's much to learn and it's a continuous process. And the following lessons will be from grantees who are 2, 3, or more years into the work of refining their learning models. So the first lesson is really to keep the focus on student learning, and that's not a huge surprise, but it's ever so easy to let the adult needs or other needs, the external needs, overshadow the student learning. NGLC grantees repeat over and over that if student learning is the constant, if that's the focus, then everything else can be the variable. We've heard from our grantees that their plans have broken down, that things have changed when students walk through the doors, and what they've all voiced as the important factor is keeping the focus on student learning and using this as the lens to adjust and achieve your outcomes. This lesson will come as no surprise, I'm sure, but we know that teachers matter and they matter a lot. If teachers aren't experiencing next-gen personalized professional learning, then the students will not be experiencing next-gen personalized learning. And we've heard from our grantees that every student learner is different, and the same is true for teachers. I'll share with you a quick story from Matchbook, which is a grades 6 through 12 charter school in our network. To personalize learning for their teachers and their staff, they give teachers 40 professional observations, 20 one-on-one coaching sessions every year. And from those observations, teachers then set individual quarterly goals, and then coaches help them to identify resources in order to provide some support to the teachers to make sure that they're achieving their goals. In other NGLC schools, this looks like teachers developing personalized learning plans to guide their growth, and then the PLPs are connected to the strategic goals of the school, so they're not happening in isolation. They're connected to the overall plan of the school, but it allows teachers to set some of their own learning goals and then submit plans for how they want to learn and how they'll show evidence of their learning. The next key takeaway from NGLC schools is that whole school transformation is key. We all know that tweaking around the edges improves what's already in existence, But in order to truly transform from schooling to learning and improve outcomes for students, schools really must focus on transformation. And we all know how difficult true and lasting change is. We're wired to rubber band as humans back to our comfortable patterns and ways of being. And so if incremental improvements aren't the answer and changing everything at once isn't the answer, what is? And in a conversation with Scott Freundheim, he's the leader of CICS West Belden, a K-8 school in Chicago. He shared a little story about why they chose whole school transformation over incremental improvements. At CICS West Belden, they were seeing stagnation of growth, low student engagement, minimal use of innovative teaching approaches and strategies, and the teachers and staff were craving more development. Their students were excited and ready for change. And he said, given that context, they were doing pretty well. They were doing okay. There was growth to be made, but it would have been easy to focus on changing minor things initially. But he really felt as a leader that they would not have seen or felt the urgency for what they needed to do to strengthen student learning and really push out that growth factor. So CICS intentionally chose the path of whole school transformation, and they're seeing the results of that approach in improved student learning outcomes, but they're also seeing it in terms of the level of engagement and ownership among staff and parents. The next lesson is to leverage the work of others. So this will be no surprise to you, but it's something that I think our grantees would shout from the tops of the buildings that they work from. It's so ever important. The work is hard enough. Don't do this alone. Leverage the work of others, and really the key piece there is to think about what are the leverage points in your model and then connect with innovators who are further along in the work and reach out to them. Ask them what they're doing, ask for examples, and then bring that work back to your context and make some customizations and personalize it so that it fits with your model and your context and it meets the needs of your students and your staff. The next lesson is really to build on richer, deeper definitions of success. So our grantees acknowledge that in order for student success in and beyond school, the definition of success really needs to include more than content knowledge or skills. The story I share with you comes from Jeff Hecht-Williams. He's the director of curriculum at Two Rivers School in DC. And he says, current standardized tests don't give us a full picture of all the skills and capacities that students need to be successful. If we're really serious about helping students become as successful as they can be, then we must focus on critical thinking, problem solving, collaboration, communication, and essential habits of character. And at Two Rivers, they've worked to develop a broader definition of student success using the My Ways toolbox that you see referenced here in the slide. The link to that is at the end of the presentation. They've also developed a set of performance tasks that measure the transferability of deeper learning skills. And those are also available at the end of this presentation by accessing the Measures That Matter Most report. The last lesson I'll share with you today is around the importance of using data. From a RAND report, and the link is at the end of the presentation, that studied 62 schools, among which NGLC schools were a member of, they found that the schools with the greatest achievement gains reported strong implementation of student grouping strategies driven by data that was in response to student needs. And then they also found that schools with the greatest achievement gains also reported a strong focus on providing data directly to students and including students deeply in the discussion of the data. So as far as instructional and assessment practices, it's clear that using data to drive and shape instruction and student grouping is extremely promising. So these last two slides are links to the information that I referenced in the earlier slides, as well as links to the reports for you to review. And if you have, I know that I just spray hosed you with a whole bunch of information, and I apologize for it being so quick. It's hard to impart lessons deeply when I'm trying to share so many. But if you have questions, we'll have time at the end, and then you can always email me. I'm sure that the email address will be provided as well. I think now we'll open it up for questions. Is that correct?
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. If anybody has any questions, please enter them into the chat box now. These are really, really great lessons for all of us, so we appreciate you sharing. We did have a comment in the chat about the Building 21 design principles, so if anybody wants to check those out, that link is now in the chat box for you there. And we did have a question from Morgan about the phrase student learning. She likes the phrase student learning, but she wants to know how this relates to student growth and achievement. So do you see a difference between those two? And if you could elaborate on that for us, that would be fantastic.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. I think when I reference student learning, I think that that's like the holistic picture. So we know that given good supportive environments and context, students will learn. And I think student growth and achievement, I use those terms to reference like the evidence of actually against standards or competencies, how students are doing in relation to those metrics. And so student learning I see as more of a global sort of holistic term, and student growth and achievement I see as attached to or have referenced in this presentation as reference to those more formalized measures of how students are doing against established metrics.
Great, thank you. And we did have one other question from Nathan. He asked if there was a link to the map of the Next Gen Learning Schools that you showed earlier. Is that on your website?
It is on our website, yes.
Okay, so we can put that link in the chat box for you, Nathan.
Thank you.
All right, I haven't seen any other questions come through, so if anybody has questions for Stephanie, we can answer them at the end during Q&A, but for now, we will transition over to Tim for the next part of our presentation today. So Tim, it's all you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tim Carnahan. I'm the Director of Next Gen Schools for LEAP Innovations. And today what I'm going to do is walk you through a sort of narrow example of how we as an organization supported 15 schools in the development of whole school transformation plans through the lens of team building, trying to get a little more granular in the way that we supported them through our programming. And so I'm going to get started really quickly to tell you a little bit about LEAP Innovations. We're a nonprofit based out of Chicago, Illinois. Our focus is bridging the gap between education and innovation. We have 3 core programs that we work on here, largely in Chicago. What we call the Collaboratory, which is connecting EdTech innovators to educators. Professional development training around personalized learning for people who are interested in getting started in personalizing their practice. The Pilot Network, which is a year-long implementation and support for personalized learning pilots, including the development of personalized learning practices and changes to instructional practice at the classroom level, supported by technology that is designed to support the personalization. And then the program that we'll be talking about most today, which is the Breakthrough Schools program. We're proud to be a part of the NGLC, and we have finished our 2nd cohort of Breakthrough Schools. It involved a 10-month professional development program that includes workshops, access to national experts, funding, and support. You'll see the photo on the right is CICS West Belden, which is a school Stephanie referenced in her presentation, who went through our first cohort of Breakthrough Schools and also went through our Pilot Network program. LEAP's philosophy around personalized learning is rooted in our LEAP learning framework for personalized learning. You can access the full framework at the link on the slide, leaplearningframework.org. There are 4 core components to our learning framework. For us, personalized learning has to be learner-focused. Learners are experiencing instruction that is relevant, contextualized, and designed around an understanding of their academic interests. Learner demonstrated, which you also see referenced as competency-based progression in many other ways. The idea that learners should be able to progress at their own pace and advance based on demonstrated competency. Learner-led, learners have ownership over their learning. and that learning dynamically adjusts to their skills, curiosity, and goals. And learner connected, which is that learning transcends the classroom in relevant and accredited ways. So our whole school transformation program was founded on the LEAP learning framework, but as Stephanie was referencing in her presentation, schools who are going through this process are actually undertaking a very deep and complicated change management process with an existing community. And so the program that we created and provided was designed to sort of walk them through that change management process to result at the end for the schools with a large-scale blueprint that can serve as a guide for them to implement their new personalized learning model within their school over the course of 3 to 4 years. This slide gets at a sort of structure, gets at sort of the sequence of our program. In Chicago, we had 42 schools apply for our second cohort. There was an application process. In April of 2015, we launched the program through a series of workshops that were led by local and national experts. We provided one-on-one coaching to the schools, formative evaluation and feedback on their plans, and each school received $30,000 in planning grants to support implementing certain parts of their new plan, to try some things out, to pay for teachers and educators to have time to work together. We brought our 15 schools in the cohort to California to see a number of next-gen school models in Oakland, the Bay Area, and Los Angeles. And then last winter, we selected 7 schools to provide launch funding for. Out of the 15 schools that submitted proposals, all of our schools submitted proposals. And then right now we're working on the implementation of those models in the schools themselves, and we'll be supporting their implementation over the course of the next year or two. Here's a snapshot of the schools from our second cohort. I don't know how familiar people are with Chicago, but the schools represented diverse student populations, and in Chicago, general geographic diversity, which is really important based on how racially segregated the city is. All of the models that were brought forward that we're providing funding for are different, and that's by design within the program, as we'll get into in a second. There are some common flavors across the school models, but the program itself was designed for the schools to design their redesigned plans and strategy around understanding the context within the change. So understanding their school community, understanding the needs and desires of their teachers, their parents, and their students. So throughout this, we had leadership support that we brought forward. And there were 4 general inputs that we brought forward to this leadership support. Human-centered design, the drivers for reform via Michael Fullen's work, innovation theory via Scott Birkin's work, and then the change management process via John Cotter. And for us, the big question was, how did these inputs manifest in direct support to the leaders and in the creation of a supportive program design? So to Stephanie's earlier point, it was really important for us that the program that we provided to the schools going through this process was personalized and actually sort of resembled the change process that schools would be going through. So we wanted them to actually be going through training and a program that was allowing them to identify their path, go through at their own pace, access resources as needed, but then also for them to be working with each other in a way that we would want, in a way that would model how students and teachers should be working with the students. If that makes sense, I hope it does. So we looked at this through the view of a long-term change management process, beginning with a human-centered design process. This was really deeply rooted in the early months of our program around empathy work, where we provided teachers, the core design teams of these schools, tools to conduct empathy interviews at their school site to really understand the needs and desires and wants of both their students and teachers and their parents. These photos get at some of the great work that came forward from that. compiled across the schools. And we had principals tell us through this process that even though they were spending time in classrooms every day, that this was the first time they really sat down and had long conversations with kids as young as first, second grade, even as young as kindergarten, up through high school, to really hear what they thought about school, what mattered to them, what was really challenging to them, and they really took this information and compiled it to help determine their design decisions. The Drivers for Reform by Michael Fullen. I'm assuming many people here are familiar with his great work. He works both at the system level but also at the school level. It's really applicable across all organizations. And we really focus the program on moving from accountability to capacity building, that change will happen if like teachers and adults in the building feel like their capacity is being built up, that they're improving their practice. Moving from what we call individualistic solutions, those interventions that were so popular over the last 10 years in the ed space, to building collaborative effort among other adults, which helps increase social capital. Moving away from the idea of technology as a solution in and of itself to pedagogy being supported by technology as being an accelerator for personalization of practice. And then this was a core component for us, moving from fragmented strategies at the school level to a sense of systemness, building interconnectivity and embedding practice within the work. Scott Berkins' Myth of Innovations. He has 10. It's a really terrific book that I encourage anyone who's working in a space to read. But there were 3 that we really focused on. So Scott Berkins' research, he believes that there are 10 core myths to this idea of innovation. 3 that were really relevant here. The myth of an epiphany. His research shows that you don't just have a light bulb that goes on over your head, that it's through work and iteration, just like Stephanie was talking about, that you really have breakthrough ideas, but it's actually a concerted effort. The second, of not just of one person, but many. The myth that we love new ideas, the idea being there that human beings are actually a very conservative species, and that there's a resistance to change at both the individual and organizational level, and that you need to account for that as you're going through this process, and that you need to think about how you can embed the new practices and ideas in the needs and wants of your clients or community. And the myth of the lone inventor, the idea that you can have just like a champion principal who can come forward and make all the changes needed, and that the vision can reside in one person, that this actually has to be spread throughout the organization that wants to be changed. And so those manifested in sort of like 4 core components for us in working with our leaders, that leaders should protect their team in terms of the innovation, they should embrace mistakes, they should encourage collaboration, and they should be brave. And it was interesting how this manifested in direct support to principals, where we had multiple coaching sessions with principals who were like, started getting nervous about how the change process was maybe impacting bottom line results within the short term, but then understanding that if they themselves weren't giving protection and space for the people trying new things in their schools to actually do that and make those mistakes, that they were going to start rolling back to more conservative ways of doing it, and they were going to actually impede their ability to do something different at the school. And that was a great learning for many of the leaders going through our program, but also a point of discomfort. And then Cotter's eight steps for change management process, the idea of creating urgency, forming a coalition, creating a vision for change. The process that we went through with our schools really worked them through all 8 steps of this process. I think right now, though, we're still in these final, steps 6 through 8, as the schools are really starting to implement the programs and working on it. But the first 5 were really important for schools going through the process. So all that's background to sort of get us ready for me to talk to you a little bit about how we worked with the principals to strategically build teams to help them implement this work through their redesign process. And so there are kind of 3 core components here that I'll talk to you about. One was just the choice of team members. being creative about team member roles and extending the team construct to help build long-term, sort of larger energy among many people within the community. So this slide here really gets at what we were talking about with our community around strategic team building and creative team composition and engagement. And these are sort of actual team constructs that we saw across our schools. In the blue boxes, you can see here the core design team here, principal, administrator, piloting teachers at identifying the sort of coalition of the willing, like teachers who are willing to try something new and different. But then what we really push schools on, we're identifying some what we call decision influencers. So it's very safe. A very safe move is to find the people who will always say yes to the new ideas. But what we encouraged leaders to do when they were building these teams for their whole school redesign were to identify some dissonant voices, to provide pushback in the early stages around the redesign process, to allow them some safe exposure to the change process, and it helps you build a soft culture of transparency, because you want those people who will go back and sort of communicate to other teachers. You want there to be transparency about the change process as you're going through this, and you also want people to be pushing your thinking as a leader, right? So that's one level there. We had some schools that got very deep. Once they did the empathy exercise, they thought, hey, we want to loop in students. They developed some student advisory committees. They modeled personalization through authentic engagement with the students, where the students were actually providing feedback on the redesign and the model itself. They were active engagers in the redesign, and they embedded the redesign process in student-led projects, which was pretty incredible. And then also parents and community. We had schools hold monthly innovation nights with family and the community members. They helped seed the redesign strategy via informal communication networks, and they provided opportunities to opt in. But what they were doing in the early stages were they were providing people the ability to, through how they built their team for the redesign process, they helped expand overall investment and community comfort with the process. Beyond that, we really push schools to think strategically about having creative team roles within their teams. So a core design team would come forward, and what they would do, and it's not so much as like having a note taker or a facilitator, but that through this process, you really need to have people, you know, as the team anchors on a vision and their design components, you want to devise roles that break the typical leader-participant construct. So you start distributing, as Morgan was commenting in the comments, you start distributing the leadership and responsibility across multiple people, so that the investment in the process starts to spread. And here are two examples of how this works in practice at the schools that we work with. And then moving forward, just coaching schools around extending their team construct so they can spread exposure, spread responsibility. It helps model the interconnected nature of the work and supports Fullen's concept of systemness. It helps increase the nimbleness of the team. And putting these structures in place, you start to actually seed and extend the sort of innovation process to deeper parts of the school, which we've seen in practice has helped accelerate scaling across the school. And you have people who know more of what's happening in like the pilot classrooms and have a better sense about how this is fitting into the long-term vision of the school. And so those three pieces, I think, in the short term for us, really helped schools bring forward strong plans where it was very clear for them that they knew who was going to be doing what, not just now, but next year, the year after that, and the year after that. And we do have a couple instances where principals have, because you're going to have turnover in schools every year, but what this process has allowed for is that if a principal transitions out of the position, they have somebody there that they can bring forward who has the institutional knowledge and some experience and exposure to the innovation. So some key learnings here for us was the importance to nurture individual voice and creativity in the context of the school. many times educators aren't put in a position to be openly creative and rethink the structure of what their school could be. But the important piece being that it has to be in context, because that contextualization helps build support among the broader community. If you're thinking about doing this process with schools, program and support design must mirror the practices expected at the school and by the leader. And that's just good program design, but I think it's really helped us because there was a lot, it was very different. As somebody who's run a lot of different programs over the years for school leaders and educators, it put us in a position to be very inquiry-based in terms of our support, which was difficult, but it empowered them to be making decisions on their own. And again, support must factor in the leader's own change process. Every leader's coming into this at a different place, and that you can't expect them to be like fully in a position to do that distributed process, leadership process, and that you have to remember that schools are themselves units within a larger organization, and you have to account for the external pressures from those traditional constructs. And so a lot of the support we provided for principals, and this helped us, I think, it helped that we were a third party working with schools, was being able to coach principals and work with them around how they can provide cover fire and protection for the change process at their schools when they were getting a lot of accountability pressure from above from the larger district structures. So that's the end of my presentation, although I do have here, if you'd like to learn more, here's my email address, our website, and the link to our framework, but I'm happy to answer any questions people might have.
Thank you so much, Tim. Great insights on change management and design. Very, very informative. We don't have any questions yet, but we had a comment from Morgan, and I know you touched on it, but do you want to elaborate on distributive leadership and how it's tied to the concepts of trust and team building a little bit more?
No, I think Morgan hit it on the head. I think it's the idea is that you start building the informal and you start building informal leaders throughout the community by increasing their investment in the change process, but also by giving them some tangible agency and voice within that process. And so I think that that can push you as a leader into some uncomfortable spaces. But if you bring forward a strategy in terms of that engagement, I think in the long term, you have more stability around the innovation because you've primed the community for the change.
Great, thank you. So if anybody else has any questions for Tim, we'll be sure to answer them at the end. But for now, we will transition over to Larry to talk about finance. So Larry, it's all you.
Great, thank you very much, Natalie, and good afternoon, everybody. First, I want to thank the two presenters who preceded me. I think when Stephanie was talking, I was vigorously shaking my head in agreement, having been with her on some of these trips and working on this project, to visit schools and working on the NGLC initiative for several years. My experience echoes exactly the lessons that she is distilling for you so well. And thank you to Tim for giving us a dissertation on change management. I learned a lot from his talk. Before I get started in the presentation, I do also want to thank the collaborating organizations that I've been working with on this project for the past 3 years or so. They include the Center on Reinventing Public Education, Afton Partners, and I see Scott and Katie are on the call, and glad to have them here. Also, RAND Corporation was a partner in this work. And I want to thank our funders, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, also Scott Benson and Matthew Joseph for their leadership as our program officers and the EDUCAUSE team. So I'm going to turn now to just ask the question, why should we continue to reach toward personalized learning? And I think everyone on this call may already be a true believer, but I want to point to a paper that, a little notes from the field that my colleague at the Center on Reinventing Public Education, Mike Dierman, just published this week. And he talked about his experience as a graduate of Ted Sizer's program at Brown about 25 years ago, how this was his exact goal back then, but he didn't have all the technology tools that might allow him to implement it in the field the way that it was envisioned in the classroom. And what's interesting and perhaps a bit, at least in the short run, discouraging is what Mike's paper and his column surmised was that his field work recently in PL schools, he found that he didn't see as much technology investment taking place as he had expected from the field at this point. And that echoed some of the findings we've had in our own work. And so the purpose of my presentation today is to say that technology and investment in technology can certainly make personalization a financially feasible endeavor, but there's something happening between what happens when we plan for it and what we actually execute. And so I want to share some of those experiences that we're learning so that the next generation of NGLC and personalized learning school innovators don't realize that same fate. So what I want to tee up for you is the idea that there are two pathways that technology may make personalized learning financially feasible. And beyond these two pathways, I should set this up by saying that obviously fundraising is very important, and the schools that we studied for this work were all NGLC grant recipient schools. And without those funds, I don't think it would have been possible for them to get as far as they have done. But I want to remind you all of a story from a few years back when Mark Zuckerberg gave the District of Newark a $100 million grant. And we all thought, wow, that's a huge grant. Imagine what we could do with that money. But I also want to encourage you to think about that amount relative to the size of the budget of Newark at that time, which was over $1 billion. So that grant, the way it was distributed, worked out to about 4 to 5% of the district's operating budget per year. In other words, what I want to focus on today is thinking about how much you already have in your existing budgets without relying on fundraising, and how you can repurpose those dollars in new and innovative ways to free up capital to invest in technology to deliver personalized learning. So along those lines, I've laid out here two pathways on this slide. The first is there's an important opportunity to increase student outcomes while holding spending constant. So without spending new dollars, I think there are a few examples that I'll point to here briefly. One is that you can increase the number of learning pathways that are available to students without raising costs. Just one example is Summit's personalized learning platform that they've made available at no cost to districts who apply for it. I'm glad to see that is expanding, I think, to 130 schools nationwide. Another option is that as the cost of information about student learning falls, we see that, or declines I should say, we see that teachers can start to allocate time a lot more efficiently. And I used a catch-all because I didn't want to bring attention to any specific ed tech startup in particular, but I know there are a lot of technology companies in the space trying to get real-time information in front of teachers about where students are learning and failing to learn so that the teachers can target their interventions more accurately and group students by need more effectively. So those are two opportunities on the technology space to improve student outcomes. I think that the second pathway is we're looking at, and this is the one that people don't want to think about so much because it involves cutting spending in some areas, but it's an important pathway to look at. So there are ways that you can decrease spending but hold student outcomes potentially constant. And I'll point you to two works on this dimension. One is there's a great paper by Marguerite Rosa and her colleagues, and I'll have links at the end, that talks about how technology can be used to dramatically increase class size during portions of the day. So this is through economies of scale, and that can lower the cost of direct instruction for those periods of time. I'm not advocating here that we pass those savings back to, say, the taxpayer, but what I am saying is that if you reduce the cost of direct instruction for a couple hours every day, you are freeing up money in your budget to invest elsewhere, and that's an important source of resources that you should consider. A second opportunity is that you can use technology to substitute for a portion of teacher-led instruction, and there's a paper by Bowen and his colleagues, Matthew Chingus at Brookings and others, who did a randomized controlled trial up at Carnegie Mellon University and found that there was a model of teaching statistics that could use technology instead of a lab that had no impact on student outcomes but did lower the cost, and there's a link to that paper as well. Moving forward, I want to share with you what we've learned from our first generation adopters. I think there are three takeaways here from the work we've done. One, that we found that the total amount of personalized learning schools spent on their programs was largely on salaries, facilities, and operations, so not technology. We found that schools reverted from a plan to spend heavily on technology and to more traditional spending patterns when the rubber meets the road and the school actually opens for business. And third, we found that schools appear to be reducing their reliance on private support, but that their long-term financial sustainability is still unclear. There were some positive indicators, though, on that dimension in the report. And this chart that I'm sharing with you just shows you what you're looking at here is schools on the right of the vertical axis spent more on that dimension than planned, and schools on the left side of the vertical axis spent less than planned on these particular activities. So green you'll see is technology spending, and blue is on salaries and benefits or human capital. And it's not a perfect one-to-one relationship, but more schools spent more on salaries than planned, and more schools also spent less on technology than they had planned. And this just kind of visually drives home the point that we're making. So something is happening between what happens on paper in the planning process and then what happens when a school opens its doors. And what I'll just share with you is some lessons that I think you can take away from that, to prevent that from happening in future iterations. The first is that this isn't our first go. This isn't 2011, 2012. There are veterans out there available for hire who have started a personalized learning school and might be available or have taught in one, and I'd encourage you to consider poaching or hiring those folks for the next iteration and benefit from their experience. Maybe they made some mistakes the first go, but this time they understand the importance of investing in technology. Second, I think it's really critical, and this links back, I think, to the point Stephanie was making. You need to make that explicit connection between technology spending, personalizing learning, and how that's going to connect to student success. And if you're not telling that story to yourself regularly, I think what we find is that people fall back on old spending patterns. They trust hiring another teacher will get them the results they want instead of protecting those funds to make the investment in their tech plan that they had envisioned. And then the third takeaway I think on here is that you really need to engage stakeholders early in if you're a charter school or if you're a district operated school, whoever's supporting your opening your school or transforming it and converting it, early in what success is going to look like 5 years down the road, and saying that may look different and require different measures of success than perhaps a traditional charter school that you might see yourself competing with. And I think just to drive this point home a little bit more, in interviews with CMO leaders and school leaders, what we heard repeatedly was, I'm investing in people right now because I've built a charter school before that was successful, and I know if I do it with teachers, I can get the results I need for my first 5-year reauthorization, and then from there I'll go back to the model that I had planned on. So we want to avoid falling back on old habits and say that we're trying to do something completely new and transformative here. The fourth recommendation here, and then I'll wrap it up, that's not on this list, but one I thought of preparing this morning, was that there is an option for funders who are on this call. They could certainly restrict the usage of their grants to technology investments to protect those. I do want to just give a word of caution. We have run into funders who've done that in the past, as a result, sometimes schools might want to change their purchase package. We had one story where a school was going to buy MacBook Airs, were switching to a Chromebook, and wanted to reinvest the $800 per unit savings somewhere else, and that request was denied. So we do have to be, funders have to be careful if they're going to put that restriction in place to give schools enough flexibility to make some of those within technology spend trade-offs, but it is an option that's worth considering. So thank you all for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Larry. Wonderful insights there. I had a question from Camille asking for you to elaborate on bullet number 2 on your last slide there to make more explicit the connection between tech spending, personalized learning, and student success. Can you talk a little bit more about that differentiation and how to make that more explicit?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think that what we're talking about here is, I don't want to pick on one model in particular, but I think that, and not pick on, but just highlight, I think that Summit in particular, where I had a chance to spend a considerable amount of time shadowing students as part of this project, did an excellent job of laying out and making a case for making sure they had a one-to-one environment, computer-to-student instructional environment, having a facility plan that allowed for the kind of flexible space that they needed to pull off their instructional model, had a staffing plan that allowed their faculty to have considerable amounts of autonomy over which students they would be working with at what points in the day, and also invested heavily in some form of a learning management system and a student information system to provide information to both students and teachers in as real time as possible about their performance, but also to provide students with learning opportunities throughout the day that they could work independently and continue to succeed. And so I think that gives us the best example that I can think of really a fully integrated plan, and I would find it hard to imagine, in a sort of in a planning meeting right before the school would open that, let's say the budget for half the laptops would be cut because everyone in the room would throw up their arms and say, there's no way we can pull off this model as envisioned if we were to make that kind of cut right now. So those investments would be protected because the technology plan was so integrated, so well integrated with the instructional plan at the school.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to shift forward here just a couple slides. And we'll open it up for Q&A. So thank you all for attending. You can also look for future iNACOL webinars there on our website, there on events. And we also have our annual conference in October. And yes, I can go back to the previous slide. But if anybody has any questions, we'll open it up for another minute or two. I see a couple people typing. If there's no more questions, we can close for today. All right, I don't see any other questions coming in, so a huge thank you for everyone for attending today. Thank you to our presenters. It was extremely informative, great insights. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise. By continuing to build field knowledge, we can make this transformation happen. So today's webinar will be recorded on our website, and we will send you all a follow-up email with the links to those resources. So thank you all very much, and have a wonderful day.